Superhero movies have been all the rage since the success of The Dark Knight and Iron Man in 2008, and not even mind-bogglingly bad movies starring Batman, who had a huge hand in getting us here, have managed to stop that train, or even remotely slow it down. It's the 10th anniversary of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It just broke industry records with Black Panther and Infinity War, which are, at the moment, the most successful superhero films of all time, and two of the highest-grossing movies in history of any kind. And it's not just Marvel. Fox has made history and buku box with its game-changing R-rated X-Men-inspired movies, the Deadpool films, and Logan. And although the DCEU has struggled to find an identity and has served up several confused and polarizing efforts, it accomplished a monumental feat no other studio has ever achieved, and beat Marvel to the punch when it had a whole decade and never even made the attempt. The first female-led superhero movie that was a hit with audiences and critics. It was an achievement just to give us one of those that didn't bomb. Wonder Woman was a smash, and the last thing anyone expected from that studio after Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad. Stories about guys and gals in or out of spandex, murderous or noble, duly deputized or vigilantes, are not only commercially viable, they're a safe bet these days compared to a lot of other genres, especially fantasy and horror. It's not just one house with a fancy car out front and all its neighbors are buying the nicest knockoffs they can afford. Marvel isn't the only game in town. Lots of superhero franchises are huge right now, and in a variety of different storytelling styles. 2008 was really prophetic in that it produced two foundational movies that couldn't have been more different from each other. One was a dead serious crime drama planned meticulously from script to shoot, and one was a more comedic espionage drama that was largely improvised. The thing they had in common was they were both real movies. Compelling, accessible to general audiences, smart stories that were undeniably good pieces of cinema despite being based on comic books. Like anything, it was obvious from that turning point that there was no magic bullet. We didn't want every superhero movie to be self-serious and broody, and we didn't want them all to be laugh riots. We just wanted good stories that were appropriate for the material being adapted. Hysterical romps like Deadpool, poignant thrillers like Winter Soldier, and everything in between. But all of them, the good ones anyway, have characters we care about and real heart and substance at the center of them. We had superhero movies like these before the Golden Age, like Richard Donner's Superman, but they were few and far between. And just because a movie is made now obviously doesn't magically make it more sophisticated or more emotionally resonant than a lot of efforts before that period, like Green Lantern. You don't have to be Marvel, you have to be good. Pretty much. That's not to say mediocre to bad superhero movies never do well at the box office, and some of those belong to Marvel, but that means that if you own the license to a comic book character anyone has ever cared about, even if, and maybe especially, if it's been tried unsuccessfully in the past, now may be the time to dust it off. As much as I loathe Hollywood's attitude of recognizable brands are safe and that everything comes back no matter what and original IPs are a novelty, back in my day we just had IPs, not that nearly as many people were even familiar with that term. I'd love to see better movies made from great material that was just mediocre before. Or new films that are more authentic to the original source material. Not because we're out of new ideas, but because there are great characters whose only exposure to a wider audience comes from film. And as comics remain a medium that, unfortunately, a lot of moviegoers find inaccessible. And who knows how long this superhero gravy train can possibly run. We've been so spoiled with excellent adaptations the last few years, and a lot of characters I couldn't have imagined we'd see come to the big screen, much less that they'd be some of the best superhero movies to date, like Guardians of the Galaxy or Black Panther, that the lackluster or abysmal attempts are that much more glaring. And I find myself yearning to finally see the red-headed stepchildren of the superhero movie world grow up and be something great. This will almost immediately be pretty dated, since new superhero movies are released and announced all the time. By this time next year, I wouldn't be surprised if there were a development about at least one property on this list, and I'm lucky there's even enough left to make a top 10 at this point. The Rewind Selection Board on Patreon voted for this topic, and by a surprisingly wide margin. Had I done this a few years ago, the list would have been much different, and could have been a lot longer. Daredevil, Elektra, and Punisher would have all been contenders, and they're enjoying new and more sophisticated life on television. Same thing with Ghost Rider, although he was just in one season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and wasn't even the same Ghost Rider. That's still a character who has yet to have his own great movie or series, but he didn't make my list because, strictly speaking, that property has been successfully rebooted now, and it's just a matter of bringing him back to the MCU again in some form. In that vein, I haven't included Blade on this list because while he's a character I'd like to see come back in some form, and it's probably inevitable Marvel will eventually do something with him, as far as we know, there's no finger on that trigger yet, but Kevin Feige has said as recently as December of last year that he'd love to do something with him eventually. The first two Blade films are excellent, and I don't feel like there's a huge void or missed opportunity if he's never adapted again, like there is with most of the things on this list. That's another character that would work best on the small screen with the street-level heroes, I think. I also want to mention Spider-Man because that's a really strange case. There's really no point in history where I would have ever put him on a reboot list, even though I'm ultimately so glad that happened, at least for now. If Sony decides to yank him away from Marvel after the contract is up, that's likely to be an unmitigated disaster, and we might be in the same or worse shape as we were in 2014 after The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I wouldn't have wanted a reboot after Spider-Man 3, because I didn't think that world was unsalvageable, despite my hatred for the origin retconning and relationship drama in that movie. And when the reboot was announced, I suggested it was too soon and fans wouldn't accept it. Raimi's franchise was beloved, and it was likely to be too different or not different enough. It ended up being both of those things. But then I wouldn't have put it on a list right after Amazing 2 either, because flawed as that is, I was still invested enough to want to see how the Sinister Six would turn out, and I didn't think it was so terrible the ongoing narrative didn't deserve some sense of resolution. Odd how, despite my myriad issues with both of those franchises, I never would have ranked it here. And now, MCU Spider-Man is more or less just what I want from that character, and I'm afraid Sony might pull the plug before we get to progress him very far. At last, here they are. 10 previously adapted superhero properties I think could use CPR, and would love to see resuscitated in some form or another. Number 10 is The Phantom. This one's at the bottom of the list because I honestly don't know if it's any more viable as a property now than it was in 1996. But while I think that movie is misunderstood, and I appreciate it for the eventual serial pastiche it was, I don't think the definitive Phantom movie has been made, and there's no reason that concept couldn't be done seriously and within a traditional narrative structure. The Phantom is about a vigilante legacy passed down through generations, from father to son, in the Walker family, beginning in the 16th century. The next in the line swears an oath to fight evil as the ghost who walks, a legend that, like Batman, actually really exists, strikes fear in the hearts of his enemies, and operates out of a cave. There are a lot of potentially compelling ideas to mine in Lee Falk's original material. Family honor and duty, personal identity versus inherited identity, immortality through passing a mantle down through the ages. It's a versatile idea that could be used in myriad ways. Again, as a period piece, as a story set in the present day, or even in the future, as it was in the 90s animated series Phantom 2049. I'd like to see an attempt at multiple time periods. A story about a Phantom now paralleling an adventure with his father or grandfather in the past. Or begin with another story set in the 30s or 40s and, if it's successful, jump ahead a couple decades and tell a story about a new Walker. A trilogy would let you do all three, past, present, and future. Perhaps cast the same actor to play his own son and grandson in each film and have him play the role very differently in each movie so we can appreciate the ways in which the son is his father, but also very much his own man. And I don't know the comics too well, so I don't know if this is too far against the premise, but I don't know why there couldn't also be a female Phantom. The character is a major influence on superhero lore, being the first comic book character to wear a skin-tight costume. And like the Spirit, he really doesn't have the notoriety or respect from non-comic reading superhero movie fans that he deserves. The Phantom touches on a lot of popular motifs, and he's got a lot of cinematic potential. He's a detective without powers, which scratches the Batman itch, and I suspect that's why his movie was greenlit in the mid-90s. He operates out of the jungle and works at a lot of jungle locales. He's globetrotting like Iron Man, and while he's not a mystical character himself, he often stumbles upon either mystical or perceived mystical artifacts, which gives him that Indiana Jones flavor, especially when the piece is set in the World War II era. I don't know how enticing that would be right now, considering Tomb Raider didn't perform, but I also don't think that movie was advertised real well. He could be as sleek and stylish as Black Panther, and while it would be difficult to sell without looking like you're ripping off that movie, it has a surprising amount in common with Black Panther. The Phantom is headquartered in a secret lair in a fictional African country, this one called Bengala. Like Black Panther, the Phantom mantle is passed from son to son and comes with a sacred duty. And each Phantom struggles to live up to his father's legacy without also living in his father's shadow and must find his own way in the world. Black Panther captured the world's imagination, and I imagine there's more interest in stories set on the African continent now than ever before. And again, the trick is to tap into that interest without the perception of writing that movie's coattails. It's not the same story and could bring a lot to the superhero table. Real detective fiction, which we have yet to see a whole lot of, even with Batman. A mythology spanning decades and centuries about a dynasty of superheroes, and maybe unabashed magic, which DC has broached with Wonder Woman, but which is otherwise lacking. There was a two-part sci-fi miniseries set in the present day featuring the Kit Walker Phantom that released in 2010. I'll review it down the line, but have yet to see it, so I can't speak to it now. It wasn't popular, and I doubt if many people are even aware of its existence. There have been rumblings here and there about a new big-screen Phantom, but nothing has come to fruition as of yet. Perhaps a serialized, ongoing story on TV is the best place for that material, which could be another great way to reboot. I do it as an anthology series, each season set in a different time period and focused on a different Phantom. If I had my druthers, I'd love to see Iron Fist rebooted precisely the same way, or even just neuralized from our collective consciousness by the Men in Black. But I think there's a series of fun and fresh movies in the Phantom, if only it was the right brand of serious and had the right marketing campaign to sell it. Number 9, Green Hornet. This is another super powerless hero with a detective element I'm not sure how much general interest could realistically be drummed up for. But after the Nolan Batman movies, there hasn't been much street-level vigilante stuff in the movies. The MCU is grounded in a science fiction world and has a lot of heroes without powers, but it's mostly really high-tech and doesn't generally get down and dirty. And that's what its Netflix counterparts are for. And like the Phantom, TV might be the very place for Green Hornet. I'd love to see season-long sting operations where Britt Reed and Kato pretend to be part of the corrupt underworld in order to bring down a segment of organized crime. I mostly want to see an authentic Green Hornet done once, whether it's for the theater or for television, to change the public perception of the character and educate people as to what he's traditionally all about. Most viewers weren't familiar with the Green Hornet in any medium when Seth Rogen's movie was released in 2011, and he's appeared in a lot of them, beginning as a radio series and adapted in serials, the 60s TV show, and comics. I was surprised not to hate that movie. That's one I still haven't gotten to an analysis on, so we'll see how I feel about it on closer inspection. But it was a farcical take on the material and more or less accomplished what it set out to do. But it wasn't a good representation of the classic Green Hornet. There's a void to be filled right now for really good, smart crime dramas, and Green Hornet would be a perfect property to revisit to that end. I like to see it done as a period piece, partly because it's traditionally a mid-20th century thing, but also because it's much easier to buy the premise of two masked, ostensible outlaws who manage to keep their uncouth reputations and their identity secret if it's not set today. A bold, ultra-stylized version with shades of Sin City, but without the vulgarity, might draw an audience. Again, play it heightened but straight, rather than a throwback to serials like The Phantom. We've been there and done that with the theatrical Phantom and Flash Gordon in 1980. There's already so much nostalgia for those films in long-standing franchises that a lot of younger viewers just accept it as part of the piece rather than pastiche, like with Star Wars, that I don't think there's a big market anymore for movies trying to recapture the flavor of movie serials, especially since most of us weren't alive to experience them when they were first shown in theaters. But I don't think Green Hornet needs to be modernized the way the 2011 movie did, although I could be made to love a present-day Hornet, I suppose, or one set in a totally ambiguous time period like Batman 1989. Were Green Hornet Inc. to partner with Warner Brothers and allow him to be crossed over with Batman again, as he was in the 60s, that could be the backdoor the property needs to get noticed and branched out on its own. Of course, it would probably need to be some other iteration of Batman besides Ben Affleck's. Heck, if it takes very long before a more popular Batman returns to the big screen, Green Hornet could help fill a street-level detective void. Now could be the perfect time to attempt a more serious take on that character. Maybe it's time to finally dust off Kevin Smith's much-loved script, which was adapted in Dynamite Comics in 2009. Number 8 is Steel. I'm using the term reboot with all these franchises because remake implies retelling the same story from the previous incarnation. I want to stress the difference here, because there are few movies I want to forget more based on comic book material I'd like to see reattempted than the embarrassing cheese fest that was Steel. Another thrown together dud trying to ride Batman's coattails almost a decade after '89 that I still haven't gotten around to an in-depth story analysis for. Can't wait for that. Steel made $1.7 million against a $16 million budget and deserved to. I love Shaq, but the man isn't a good dramatic actor, and it had only slightly more to do with the character it was based on than Halle Berry's Catwoman. At least he still retained his alter ego's name, John Henry Irons. Catwoman was about some person who wasn't Selena Kyle or even vaguely reminiscent of that character named Patience Phillips. If the Catwoman crew had made Steel, his name would be like Courage Johnson. Steel still has questionable marketability, but not for the same reason the Phantom and Green Hornet have. He's not a pulp hero, but a minor character in DC Comics who I think can stand fine on his own, but is often a supporting hero in Superman stories. He hasn't had his own ongoing series since 1998 and tends to be used for the sake of Death of Superman nostalgia more than anything else. But just a year after Shaq Steel made the 5 people who saw it wonder how it wasn't relegated to a TV special at the 11th hour, Blade proved that an unknown comic character can stand on his own feet. And another unknown African-American character at that. I think Blade had the luxury of looking like an original property and not falling into the traditional superhero mold. It didn't matter that it was based on a comic, and the fear of sitting through a tired superhero formula didn't deter it, like with Men in Black. Steel looked like a typical generic cash-in superhero movie, and the suit of armor probably worked against him. But the great, down-to-earth, urban superhero movie has yet to be made, and if the marketing had the right attitude, maybe a good Steel movie could perform. Steel kind of has the same problem the Phantom does in being set partially in Africa. There's a popularity it could take advantage of, but it can't come off like a quick cash-in or knockoff. Steel could be DC's answer to Luke Cage, a black hero who comes from the streets, who's a man of the people, fights for the little guy, and is inspired by his personal heroes to do what's right and take on injustice. Unlike Blade, I don't know that Steel can work as a solo project without being spun off. Sure, I'd much prefer the John Henry Irons who's lost his way until he's saved by Superman and then follows his example and uses his technical expertise to build a bodysuit and make himself into a Superman. It reinforces what Superman's ideals are all about. Is a great argument for why Superman is about more than just his powers, and living in a world where most of the superheroes or the only superhero has supernatural powers makes John Henry more special and more courageous. And without developing interest as a Superman character on his own terms first, Steel could easily come off as a blatant Iron Man ripoff. He's yet another character who might be better suited to a TV show, though with Luke Cage and Black Lightning, he might be perceived even more there as a knockoff. Not, of course, because he's a black superhero, but because he's an urban street-level hero. But I love how old school and futuristic Steel can be at the same time. And I love seeing the fruits of Superman's labor in the form of a man without powers who followed his example. I think he deserves to be more than the butt of jokes about an unwatchable mess most of the world has forgotten, if it ever knew about that movie at all. Number 7 is The Shadow. Who knows if The Shadow will ever get a great, ultra-stylized, atmospheric, big-screen interpretation? The Shadow knows. This is the first item on the list that I think has a pretty good adaptation already that wasn't misunderstood by audiences. Like The Rocketeer, it just wasn't seen by a lot of audiences. I mean, I don't think critics liked it as well as general audience goers, but it wasn't The Phantom. There was a clear logic to trying dark, gritty pulp heroes after Batman's success. After all, you don't have Batman without the Shadow, but nostalgia pieces set in the 30s or 40s about costume crusaders didn't go over well in the 90s, regardless of quality. A lot of critics didn't like the Shadow as much as I did, but I doubt if even a more traditional and less off-the-wall take would have raked in more cash, given the lack of interest in movies like The Rocketeer. The Mask of Zorro was a big hit in 1998, but while Zorro was another return to serial nostalgia, it falls in a different category. It's not a pulp character, and it perhaps scratches more itches, playing on older audiences' memories of westerns and old Hollywood. Which is interesting because The Rocketeer was a movie all about old Hollywood. And Zorro was a character that, unlike The Shadow, had a long on-screen history, dating back to the silent film era. One of these days, I'll have to do a rewind on the Mark of Zorro from 1920, partly because Zorro counts as a superhero as much as Batman does, and partly because that's the oldest possible movie I could cover on this series. I have no idea how marketable the Shadow would be right now, but he's so important in shaping the darker side of the superhero film genre that it's a shame if he never carved out his corner of it. He would also fill that detective void and the ultra-stylized and gritty void that Batman is hardly claiming at the moment. Anti-heroes continue to be popular, and what's interesting about the Shadow is that he falls in between hero and anti-hero. He's the morally ambiguous, self-righteous, larger-than-life crime fighter who makes the cynical case for crossing a moral line for the greater good. He's the protagonist who's also the master manipulator, with his web of informants that he conscripts into his cause by saving their lives and then using them for his own ends. A movie that goes all the way with Lamont Cranston's narcissism, a man who preys on the fears of criminals like Batman, but sees himself as the savior of the world, almost like Ra's al Ghul, could be fascinating and unlike anything else in the genre right now. What do you think, Bryan Cranston as Lamont Cranston? Could work. Like The Phantom, it could be set in any era. The Shadow is traditionally a period piece, and I always appreciated the Alec Baldwin version for not feeling the need to update it just because of Batman. But there have been more present-day Shadow stories in the Dynamite comics recently, and the Shadow Batman crossover by Scott Snyder and Steve Orlando is quite good. I'd like to see a Shadow movie with a similar style and attitude to that story. The Shadow is a character who sustains his life past its natural end, so as a franchise, it's another property that could be set in multiple time periods and with the same actor in the lead role. Number 6 is Power Rangers. I sort of hate having to put this movie on the list, as I don't think the 2017 Power Rangers movie was terrible, or that there wasn't plenty of interesting stuff to do with that interpretation moving forward, and I certainly rooted for it to succeed. But it's also not what I wanted in a lot of ways. It underperformed, and Saban let the logo expire, so it pretty clearly wasn't going to get a sequel anyway. But now that Saban has sold the Power Rangers brand wholesale to Hasbro, that casket is surely locked, buried, and encased in a steel tomb now. I wouldn't have put this on the list if that franchise was still going. The future of Power Rangers is suddenly wide open, and I couldn't be more curious to see what Hasbro does with the brand, and how quickly they try another big screen reboot. Because there are a couple of ways to interpret what happened with that film. Did it fail because there's just not enough interest in Power Rangers in general, or because there's not enough interest in a serious, gritty reboot? I'm honestly not sure, but my gut has always told me that if only it embraced the bright colors and unique iconography of the TV show, more people would have seen it. Yes, it needed to be smarter, and it needed a more concrete internal logic with well-developed and relatable Rangers, but I think, like J.J. Abrams' Star Trek did for non-Trekkies that grew up with Star Trek, it would have ignited a nostalgia wave for 90s kids, who grew up with it but hadn't thought about it in 20 years, if only it looked more like Power Rangers. I've talked to a lot of people who loved that movie because it reminded them of their childhoods, but was made for them now. It was something they could take a little more seriously. And it certainly achieved that. Its Rangers aren't interchangeable, and they're mostly compelling and engaging. Except for Jason, who's a troublemaker because he's just so done with football. But the trouble was in getting some of those adults there in the first place, doing more to separate it from every other teen drama to attract that audience, and making it look fun and inviting for younger audiences. If the point was to make a Power Rangers movie that's not for little kids at all, that's an unnecessary risk, I think. There's nothing important to the story that movie is telling that can't be in a movie that's also aimed at kids. And I mean, it was aimed at kids. It had a huge toy line of figures and Zords and swords and masks that looked like no fun to play with, and that I continue to see on clearance shelves everywhere. But it needed more Power Rangers action throughout, and to move at a faster clip to keep kids interested. Not to mention the few moments that are just not appropriate for children. It shouldn't try to make everyone happy, but there's no reason it couldn't appeal to the kinds of people Power Rangers has always appealed to, and still be aimed at general audiences. It overcompensated in focusing on character dynamics, and it skimped out on the mythology and the toys and wasn't comfortable with the stuff that made the series a phenomenon. Stories about kids who find a spaceship or have superpowers bestowed on them are a dime a dozen. What makes Power Rangers unique is the look and the style. It's not a Spider-Man situation where we need a few years to let people get used to the idea that the last version is over and get hungry for the franchise again, but it would have to look very different from the 2017 version, and I'd think feature a different villain and not be another origin story, namely Zed. I don't think the last movie looked enough like Mighty Morphin to really sell it on the aesthetic, and after the success of the Boom comics, and Shattered Grid specifically, I'd start there again, maybe with Tommy there already, and incorporate elements from other shows for the diehard base. The comics have set a wonderful precedent for the original aesthetic with a more fleshed out and consistent mythology and a cast of characters with real dimension. Lean right into the absurdity, put Mighty Morphin back in the title, and do the original suits, Zords, Command Center, and bad guys on a big budget. I think there's a real possibility Hasbro will look at what Boom is doing and give us precisely that. If they move forward with their plans for a shared universe, Power Rangers will almost certainly be part of that, which means we could end up with the Rangers in a continuity with Transformers, G.I. Joe, and ROM. That I don't need, nor do I really imagine Hasbro realistically being the next big multi-property universe, but if it gives us great, serious, but fun Power Rangers, I'll take it. I also think a more sophisticated alternative to the regular rotating cast series for longtime fans on Netflix or another streaming service is viable, especially with the massive response Boom got to their live-action teaser to Shattered Grid starring Jason David Frank. I don't want gruesome rated R Power Rangers or anything, but a show with real violence and more human stakes could be a big hit. I'd set it in a parallel universe to the original continuity, make that continuity tighter and the series more logically connected, and make it a multi-generation team of new Rangers and Rangers from yesteryear, with a cast of actors from previous shows revising their roles in another universe. 5 years ago, that would have sounded like a pipe dream pitch, something that could only happen in fan films. Now, it sounds expensive, but I think also really commercially viable. Number 5 is Ninja Turtles. This one would have been on the list even if the last franchise wasn't dead in the water. We got our big, loud, dumb, Transformers-esque Ninja Turtles movies out of our system, and at least that first one was an exercise in course correction that wasn't what anyone wanted, but was as inoffensive as it could have been. It is time now to go back to basics. I've heard some Turtles fans suggest that we've had our definitive street-level Turtles movie in 1990 and it can't be beat, so we should just leave well enough alone and stop trying big-screen Turtles altogether. I disagree. In a perfect world, we'd have had sequels to that movie that would have stayed in that vein and based some of their stories on Eastman and Laird arcs, like City at War. It would be strange to go back to that continuity now and bring back the animatronic suits, but why not try something even more stylized that looks like the classic Mirage comics? You make the world look like a comic book, and you can blur the lines between live action and CG to the point that no one is even making the distinction. Live action human characters, mocapped person-sized turtles in a noirish and chromatic shadowy world, TMNT a la Sin City. Edgy, but as okay for kids as the original film was. Ninja Turtles cartoons have homaged the original comic style so much, why not finally just do it? That might not sound like the most accessible Turtles movie, and I may sound like a rabid Turtles fanboy thinking wishfully, but there's so much versatility in the Turtles property that could be mined relatively inexpensively if realism was no longer the name of the game. I mean, sure, if Guardians is possible, so is live-action TMNT with CG Turtles, but getting a huge bankroll after the last franchise petered out might be tricky, and a super stylized, partly animated Turtles would be a way to cut costs while creating something aesthetically fresh and give Turtles that minimalism that made it work so well in 1990. I love another low-key street-level story. Although, were I Nickelodeon, I would be leery of yet another origin so soon after the last. A Shredder Returns story wouldn't be a bad idea. Introduce us to this world but not from the very beginning, and then treat it like a sequel to a redundant and superfluous movie that was never released. But I also think some of the goofy 87 cartoon stuff could be wonderfully dramatic and cinematic, just like it can with Power Rangers, as Tom Waltz has proved time and again in his epic run at IDW, especially with his portrayal of Krang as a master strategist. There's still so much great material to adapt in a smarter Turtles movie, Rat King, Slash, Metalhead, and while it's a wonderful world for serialized storytelling, it also lends itself well to occasional larger events. It has a long tradition of both in the comics. It's also not a property you'd have to wait on. So many viewers were ambivalent toward the 2014 film, and like 17 people bothered with Out of the Shadows, most of them were probably just getting their Stephen Amell fix waiting for the next season of Arrow to hit. Judging from the fact that the first of those movies actually did well enough to justify a sequel, I'd say there are plenty of people that want to give Turtles their money. There's a great several movie series there if someone just had the vision to deliver it in a purer form. And if they were smaller films, there might, dare I say, even be a shared universe there. Solo Turtles movies, like micro-series movies, Splinter and Feudal Japan, if you went with the Walt's reincarnation idea, Casey Jones, Mutanimals maybe. Hey, I never thought anyone would care about Ant-Man, but they did. I see a world of possibilities in Turtles. Number 4 is Green Lantern. So is that Green Lantern Corps movie in 2020 still happening? We haven't heard any rumblings about that in a while, but even if we had, I wouldn't trust it until I saw a trailer. Warner Brothers has been all over the place with the DCEU, and it continues to be very reactionary. A movie does poorly, and we scrap a bunch of plans while tweaking the next one in the can until it hardly resembles the original version. A movie does well, and that's the direction we're going with the whole line. After Wonder Woman, it was okay, let's forget about this interconnected, larger story over several movies thing and just tell stories. Who cares about the continuity? Now, I agreed with that. That's what they should be doing until they land on some real tonal consistency and a concrete strategy for their shared universe. But I have no confidence at all that they'll stick to that. Who knows what kind of impact Justice League had on their plans behind the scenes? That was already such an outdated mulligan as it released that Warner should have just put it out and then ignored it. But since then, Whedon has left Batgirl, and Flashpoint is maybe no longer happening? Though how much any of that has to do with the failure of Justice League, I have no idea. I find all their announcements really hard to keep up with, and I never know what I can trust when I hear them. I honestly wish they would just stop announcing stuff. They continue to announce and unannounce projects right and left, scrambling to find an identity when they really should just let filmmakers tell cool stories and forget about the continuity at this point. Maybe when they get their ducks in a row after more than one solid outing, do a crisis movie and put some continuities together. And Green Lantern is one of those movies you can easily make in a vacuum. Like Guardians, it doesn't have to touch anything until you're ready for it to. The irony with Green Lantern is that the Ryan Reynolds movie was supposed to be the first film in a shared universe, and we're 5 years into the one Man of Steel started, and we've only seen the Lantern Corps so far as a cameo in a Justice League flashback. It would have been a neat place to start a universe if only we'd started from the Guardians place, out in space, and worked our way inward as opposed to Marvel, which began with a non-superpowered inventor on Earth and slowly peeled the curtain back. It also, as I've suggested before, would have beaten Guardians to the quirky cosmic punch, and had it been a big movie, the sci-fi landscape might be very different now. But that's still a thing I'd like to see done right, and the best way to go, I think, is the movie that was pitched early on after Man of Steel, when Warner's gave us a timeline of movies they didn't stick with after the BVS disaster. Again, Green Lantern Corps. Make it a movie about a team of lanterns from different planets that all come together to fight a big galactic threat, and have a human lantern as our eyes in. Could be Hal Jordan, Kyle Rayner, Jon Stewart. We can learn all about how the rings and the lanterns work, who the Guardians are, not the ones with the talking tree and raccoon, but the stodgy ones with the blue faces and big heads who run the Corps, and all the rules of the space police as we see them in action, rather than holding the audience's hand as we go through a paint-by-numbers origin story. It would attract Guardians fans if they didn't look like a copycat. Such a weird world we live in, where Green Lantern might look like a poor man's Guardians of the Galaxy, but could be a very different thing, too, a dead serious police drama set in an equally absurd world as Guardians. The logical choice of threat is the Red Lanterns, and I'm not just saying that because they're my favorite Lantern thing. The Red Lanterns are a team of bad guys to fight rather than a big singular force of nature or one big honkin' bad guy. We could use the contrast in ideologies to appreciate what the Corps is all about, and they could introduce us to the whole Lantern spectrum to set up other Corps and maybe build to a bigger Lantern event movie like Blackest Night. This one is likely inevitable, but it's so high on the list because Green Lantern is a big black spot on modern superhero films. A giant missed opportunity, and one that, if it had been handled right, might have steered DC away from the shared universe mess it's in today. And at the same time, so much has changed that general audiences are suddenly primed for galactic space cops in a way they weren't 3 years before Guardians, when Green Lantern was released. It's also smart to wait this long before releasing another Green Lantern. That was certainly a Batman and Robin situation. The air had to clear before it was time to walk back into that nuclear testing ground. And the Lego movies and Deadpool have gotten Green Lantern bashing out of their systems, maybe. Now is finally the time to do something bold and grand with Green Lantern. Here's hoping DC gets it out before Marvel makes a Nova Corps movie. Number 3, I am sad to say, is X-Men. The X-Men franchise is the oddest in superhero history because it's the longest running, generally successful franchise, and it has the least consistent, most busted continuity. It's number 3 on my list, and it's a series that's still being made, with spin-offs in the Deadpool films that have been unbelievably successful. The X-Men movies, the good ones anyway, are some of my favorite superhero movies, and X2 and Days of Future Past particularly resonate with me on a deeply personal level. I've never been more excited about the future of a franchise after Days of Future Past, and I've never been more ready to see one put to bed after Apocalypse. There's still great stuff happening in this line, which remains tied to the world Singer built with those first 2 movies, but there just is no coherent, living and breathing universe anymore. Days of Future Past cleverly soft rebooted, and the sky was the limit for what could be done in the reset timeline post-1973. And then, 2 years later, the same director throws it all away with a movie that not only doesn't care about pre-established characters and lore that the reboot couldn't have changed, much like Khan's alterations in Star Trek Into Darkness, but it wasn't interested in the very stuff it set up for its own subsequent outings, namely Mystique nabbing Wolverine under the guise of Stryker at the end of Days of Future Past. It pains me to say it, but I'm ready for a new X-Men continuity, one that doesn't feel the need to retcon itself every other movie or more, and with a little foresight so it can build an ongoing serialized soap opera in the classic X-Men tradition. And I'm a broken record, but the best place for it would be streaming television, perhaps with event movies on the big screen. Most people expect a reboot if the Disney-Fox deal comes together, and that the X-Men will be either folded into the MCU or set in a parallel universe. I could see Marvel going either way with that, but Deadpool and X-Force almost certainly wouldn't be touched, as they're being treated like their own tangentially related franchise, and there's incredibly more money to be made with them than with the current X-Men franchise. Whether on the big screen or on television, considering the production values on Legion and the multiple costume and superpowered characters the CW superhero shows manage on a regular basis, I don't think that's unrealistic. I'd like to see another continuity we're thrown in the middle of, with a new generation of X-Men taught by the first, maybe the original 5 or the main teachers at the school. If Mr. Sinister, or Miss Sinister, as the rumors go right now, doesn't appear in Dark Phoenix, he might be a good villain for the freshman outing. Apparently John Hamm was almost Sinister and would have been revealed at the end of Dark Phoenix. So if the line was rebooted after that, he would be the logical bad guy. Start with a villain we haven't seen before in the previous incarnation, but can't stop hinting at, and one that's all about exploiting mutant biology for his own ends. Right away, you have a villain who believes in genetic superiority, like Magneto, but not any sort of justice. I'd like to see X-Men get out of period pieces and go back to an ambiguous time period, back to the not-too-distant future, and populate the team with characters we've never developed properly, or that we haven't done the classic comic versions of, like Kitty Pryde, Nightcrawler, Gambit, and Rogue. It would be difficult to separate it from what's been done before, since the same universe gave us grounded black uniforms and then later, but, in the past, something more akin to the Joss Whedon astonishing suits in First Class. And then Deadpool just straight up did that suit with Negasonic Teenage Warhead. But no one would bat an eye at individual and colorful suits now. If you just translated the 90s animated series look to the big screen, people would absolutely accept it. And Deadpool has done a great job realizing the traditional X-Men look and feel to live action, unapologetically and unabashedly. And to be fair, we did already try some of that kind of stuff with Apocalypse, like Storm's Mohawk look. Arguably, suddenly doing colorful and varied looks wouldn't be special now that the franchise has gotten so far away from the understated Singer look of 2000. So again, the best way to distinguish the reboot and make X-Men fresh would be to go to television. This would be a lot simpler proposition if no one cared about anything in the current X-Men franchise. It's already a shared universe, just not one with a continuity that gels, sort of like the old Universal monster films. I love to see all the X stuff squarely fit together like the MCU, but I also like where Deadpool is headed, and I'm intrigued about New Mutants. I'd love to see a clever, soft reboot again, if and when Disney buys Fox, that uses Deadpool, a fictionally aware being who knows about all these different worlds that don't fit together and that they're all made by real-world corporations to make money, somehow help put them all together. Kind of a Deadpool heals the Marvel Universe. And with all his talk about confusing timelines and references to movies that don't fit in his timeline, not to mention that he's now visited other timelines with a time travel device that shouldn't be able to do that, it might feel like a really natural and nifty meta direction to take him in. The only problem with all this is that movies that have traditionally been okay for kids to see would be spearheaded by a really raunchy rated R character they really shouldn't be exposed to yet. It's great that Fox has come around on R-rated superhero movies and that Logan was so closely related to the early X-Men movies but just not okay for kids, but I don't really see them or Disney making a line of very interconnected movies, some of which are super adult and rated R and some that aren't. Deadpool stands alone and feels more like a live-action movie set in the pre-existing comics universe, and Logan was for an audience that grew up with these films, plus also kind of lives in his own alternate history. So spinning a new X-Men continuity out of Deadpool sounds like an unlikely move, unless Fox wanted to put all their X-Men eggs in the rated R basket, and decide that they don't need a younger demographic for that property at all. Which would make me a little sad. I'd like kids to be able to experience X-Men and what it has to say about peaceful coexistence and equality, but there's a wealth of great stories you could tell if you could allow your heroes and villains to go to any emotional place without having to tone down violence or subject matter, as we saw with Logan and Deadpool 2, which is a pretty great X-Men movie. I also don't know that kids really care as much about X-Men as much as the Marvel movies and Spider-Man. I could get behind X-Men as the mature, totally grown-up superhero shared universe, and perhaps that is the key to the future of that property. Number 2, to no one's surprise, is Fantastic Four. No property has a worse on-screen reputation than the FF. Moviegoers who have never read a Fantastic Four comic tend to think that because of the property's unfortunate theatrical track record, the concept is just too hokey to do seriously and no one's gonna accept it. Which is ridiculous, but a sentiment I understand if you're unfamiliar with the comics. Fantastic Four can be really lighthearted. It can also be absolutely chilling. It's about adventure and exploration of science and space and the unknown, but it's also about how horrifying those things can be. And it's often about hubris and abuse of power. Check out some of Jonathan Hickman's run for, I think, the perfect tonal balance. That's a really atmospheric and sober Fantastic Four. It's dead serious, but with plenty of levity and lots of goofy comic book stuff that's played totally straight. That's the blueprint for a great Fantastic Four movie, I think, and it would be unlike anything we're doing in superhero movies right now. The way to get something like that successfully done, though, is not through yet another Fox reboot. At least not right away. 3 strikes and it's out. The 2005 movie was already at a disadvantage because of the notorious reputation of the unreleased Roger Corman movie. It did well enough for a sequel, but that was met with more than a lukewarm reception, especially from Surfer and Galactus fans. And so the studio was in an even harder spot when they tried one more time with the smoldering disaster that was Josh Trank's Fant4stick. There's just no credibility there. Fox could put out a masterpiece rivaling Alien or Blade Runner right now, and it would tank. So they are wisely looking to a Doctor Doom solo film right now, and that has real potential, especially with Legion showrunner Noah Hawley writing. They're also developing a Silver Surfer movie written by Brian K. Vaughan, which is beyond exciting. That's a guy with unparalleled imagination who has a wonderful grasp of cosmic out-there notions. And that's why Silver Surfer isn't on this list. Also, after 2 Deadpool movies and Logan, it seems like Fox is willing to take risks and try new weird things. If the idea is to set up a Fantastic Four universe without the FF, to get the audience on board with some of its major supporting characters they haven't necessarily soured on or even care about yet, this could be a brilliant strategy. Build confidence in the world and then introduce the team folks say can't be taken seriously. Fox's only other path forward with the property is the MCU. Marvel has the clout and consumer confidence to release a Fantastic Four movie that people might give a shot on its own, without having to establish it in other things first. As much as I'd like to see that happen, because Marvel without the First Family and Cosmic Marvel without Silver Surfer and Galactus is weird, if Fox builds a really smart and creative FF universe on its own, especially one that pushes envelopes Marvel is trepidatious about pushing, I might be more excited about that. I also think both might be possible. Fox starts their own FF world, and Marvel finds a way to fold it into the MCU later. It's only a matter of time before Fantastic Four comes back, but it's this high on the list because with all these great versions of classic comic characters in the movies, FF is leaving the biggest gap. It just should be there, and its reputation is unacceptable. We got good versions of Ant-Man and Black Panther, but Fantastic Four is the property nobody thinks is cinema-worthy. It's the reason there is a Marvel universe. Hopefully, whether it happens in its own continuity or at Marvel, fourth time's the charm. And the number one franchise I would most like to see rebooted right now is Superman. Superman is cool. He doesn't need new values or to be more angsty or edgy or ticked off all the time or isolated from humanity or constantly on the brink of fascism to be cool. He is already. The current version was created with the attitude that Superman is too powerful, unrelatable, and irrelevant. Meanwhile, Marvel has presented us with not one but three characters who stand for a lot of what Superman traditionally stands for: truth, justice, equality, selflessness, working for common good, and leading by example rather than forcing your will on people. Captain America, Luke Cage, and Black Panther are all better Supermans than the DCEU Superman. And then Patty Jenkins goes off and makes a fantastic Superman movie for DC and calls it Wonder Woman. I hope Man of Steel 2 finally happens. I kind of want Patty Jenkins to direct it. And Henry Cavill finally gets to play an inspiring Superman in a movie made by people who love and understand the character. But no matter how great his Superman finally becomes, he'll be a different guy. It'll be a retcon job. Justice League doesn't show us a Superman back from the dead who finally finds himself and comes to care about the world apart from Lois Lane, who remains his reason for living and the only thing keeping him from snapping. It just pretends, like Suicide Squad did, like he's always set the classic Superman example and like the world was lost without him, even though in BVS, society was, at best, polarized about whether he could be trusted, never mind whether he was known by the public long enough to have the kind of impact he's had on the public by World Without Superman in the comics after his death. Cavill is a good actor and was always a good choice for Superman, and he deserves to finally get to play a great script. But it's a little late to really turn the public around on that version unless Flashpoint happens and the continuity itself is made to forget about BVS and Justice League. Any way you slice it, people are never gonna not make fun of the mustache thing. Warner's has been announcing non-DCEU movies and starring characters we've already used there, like the Joker origin movie. So an Elseworlds-esque Superman movie is possible, and could give us a do-over even if the DCEU version marches forward. I'd hate that for Cavill, and it's ridiculous if the Elseworlds version of Superman, the what-if alternate history Superman, is the optimistic one that actually fights against modern cynicism instead of embracing it. Matthew Vaughn and Mark Millar pitched an epic trilogy that sounded amazing back in 2008, which would have gone from Krypton 1,000 years ago all the way to Superman still alive in the future as the sun goes supernova at the end. He says he was shooting for an uplifting and fun movie that you'd walk out of feeling like $1 million. That's obviously not a pitch that fits with a shared universe, and it's natural that's where his head was right after The Dark Knight was released, a self-contained, sprawling Godfather-level epic, as he described it. But I'd like to see something like that as an alternative Superman project disconnected from everything else. There was talk for a while about Vaughn directing Man of Steel 2, but that project is in limbo right now, as far as we know, and as much as he's a great choice to help salvage the DCEU, I'd much rather see him do his own thing. I also really don't want to see Red Sun, Millar's Elseworlds story about Superman raised in the Soviet Union, until we've had a definitive modern take on the classic version of the character. Superman is as relevant and necessary as he's ever been, and it's embarrassing that it's taking so long for Warner's as a studio to appreciate his cultural relevance and why he resonates with people, and that just because a hero tries to do the right thing and is physically powerful doesn't mean he has to or should be perfect. A good Superman movie should make it difficult for Clark to uphold his ideals in a world full of people who think might makes right, or that they must compromise their basic principles to survive. It should be about an internal conflict, the ways in which his powers make his life hard, not easy, and about the massive responsibility Superman has because of how difficult it is to trust people with power. We should want to be the example he tries to set, but being Superman himself should look daunting and impossible. The sacrifices he makes should be what puts us in awe of him, not that he can do what he does. And as I've always said, You want to make a dark Superman movie? Fine. Just don't make a cynical Superman movie. Give us a story of Superman having to somehow keep his optimism and sense of hope, even while the world seems determined to take those things away from him. So there are the 10 properties I'd most like to see new, fresh takes on. I didn't put Batman on the list because I don't think the DCEU version is in the same unsalvageable place as Superman, though who knows if Ben Affleck will play the role again. Some runners-up: The Mask. I don't want a remake of Jim Carrey's movie, but I'd love to see an attempt at a horror film with The Mask, something closer to the original comic concept, but less gratuitous in its violence and more thoughtful about its ideas. The original Mask is about a man who loses all his inhibitions, takes anything he wants, and kills whoever is in his way. It could be an interesting study in what exactly holds most of us back from going off the deep end. I don't know if anyone would see it, but Disney has flirted with rebooting the lesser-known 80s comedy Condor Man, which I found a little nonsensical, but I liked the premise of when I reviewed it on Superhero Rewind. It's about a comic book artist who translates his superhero gadgets to reality and falls into a spy mission as his fictional superhero counterpart. I think another attempt at that could be great. I also think another pass at the return of Captain Invincible could be amazing if the right team got a hold of it, because that's a very special blend of cheese, absurd comedy, social commentary, and genuinely compelling storytelling. Eric and I had a conversation about this the other day, and he has about convinced me this is a good idea, but I remain leery that someone could make that material as great as the original film almost is, and that it wouldn't take itself too seriously or be all farce. And I don't know what you do to make that soundtrack more tonally consistent and make it a real musical rather than just a movie with some scenes where people suddenly break out into song, without losing some of the charm. And casting is key. Without Alan Arkin and Christopher Lee, that movie is nothing. But we haven't tried the big screen superhero musical yet. That would be a way to finally broach that. Some properties I wish we'd leave well enough alone and not remake. The Crow. Another film set in the same continuity about a different protagonist is okay, but the original is so good, there's just no reason in my mind to mess with it. And that movie is so much about the time it was made in, with its heavy metal sensibilities and goth atmosphere. It's outdated if you set it in present day, and if it's a period piece, there's just no reason to do it unless you can improve on it. That remake has been in start and stop mode for years, and it looked like it was finally happening until today as I'm recording this. Jason Momoa and director Corin Hardy just pulled out over creative differences with the studio. So maybe I have nothing to worry about. That movie may never get made anyway. I do think the Hellboy reboot has a lot of potential, so I won't say I don't want that series tried again, but I do wish money were no object and that Del Toro could have made his third film, which would have been a bank breaker for the studio. That series was building to bigger things, and it feels unfinished, though certainly not Amazing Spider-Man unfinished. Then you've got HBO making a new Watchmen miniseries, because we just can't leave that story alone. As a lot of you know, I love Snyder's version, and can't really see it adapted much better. But recently, Damon Lindelof said it's not really another adaptation so much as a remix, and it's set in present day now. At least he's not telling the same story, and at least I got an adaptation I like, so even if it's awful, it's not like he can ruin the material. But I do wish DC and Warner Brothers would stop trying to milk money out of it. And I don't know if I need another Rocketeer, although as good as that movie is, I guess there's room for improvement, and if there were more interest this time, it might be worth trying again to create more awareness for the character, although the reboot is a gender swap, so it would be a different character. Apparently, though, Disney is also working on a TV show about the original Rocketeer, and that's what I'd do if I was bringing that character back. It's my answer to everything. Just make it a TV show. So while I don't love the idea of remaking the film, doing a new serialized story is intriguing to me. And, of course, as much as I'd love to see a great Spawn reboot, I'm not keen on the one we're getting. Jamie Foxx is a good pick for Spawn, if he really gets to do anything in the role, since Spawn's going to be in the background and hardly say anything. Todd McFarlane cannot write or plot to save his life, and he's also trying his hand this time at directing. I think he's out of his depth, not playing to his strengths, and I think the movie is bound to be overly long, incoherent, and boring. I lived with his writing for the better part of 2 years, and I've read him recently. He's a brilliant artist, but he's not a good storyteller. I hope against hope that he proves me wrong. The big thing I've learned in making this list is that as much as the superhero genre has taken over the box office, it hasn't all been done. And there are plenty of ideas and flavors left to be attempted or to try again now that movies based on comics are so much more commercially viable than they were the last time we tried more pulp throwback or detective stories. We're spoiled with a lot of fantastic, thought-provoking, and hilarious superhero movies right now, and that landscape provides a lot of potential for opportunities I hope studios and rights owners take advantage of to tell great stories while superheroes are still all the rage. Thanks a lot for listening, folks. Sure appreciate it. Next time, I'm going to be doing a science fiction rewind on the 1986 Transformers movie, and then directly after that, I'm going to be doing another TV show season overview on Superhero Rewind, but I am not yet ready to announce which show, and I will tell you about that after the next science fiction rewind. If you want to help me out with the show, go to patreon.com/Geekvolution for just $2 a month. You can get access to our twice monthly uncensored talk show, Geekvolution After Dark. You can also get 24-hour early episodes of Superhero Rewind. At the $5 tier, you can join the Rewind selection board and occasionally help me choose a movie or topic for an episode of Superhero Rewind. And at the $50 tier, you can request a movie to be reviewed for Superhero Rewind. And finally, at the $10 tier, you can become a Patreon producer, and I will read your name at the end of every episode of Superhero Rewind. And I would like to thank our Patreon producers right now. You guys are great. Thanks a bunch to Dylan Mustiello, Jackson Rasco, Nick Manna, Eamon Singleton, Cletus Winslow, Ethan, Remy LeBlanc, Derek Jacob, John Early, Gui D, Caleb, Malik Myers, Neil McCalmont, Lone Wolf Jedi of Gotham, David Crabtree, Michael McAllister, Chewbacca's Lover, Ian McKee, Todd Schmuck, Malik Myers, and Jeffrey Patrone. Once again, thank you so much for listening, everybody. Peace. I'm out. Bye.